There's a line Seneca wrote nearly 2,000 years ago that, once you actually sit with it, is almost impossible to unhear. He observed that people act as though they are mortal in everything they fear, and as though they are immortal in everything they want. Read that twice, because it's doing more work than it first appears to. When something threatens us, a health scare, a danger situation, a moment of real risk, we respond with total seriousness, fully aware that our time is limited, that this body will not last forever, that the clock is genuinely running. But the moment we shift from fear to desire, from what we're avoiding to what we're planning, that same awareness of mortality quietly disappears. We plan as though we have unlimited time to eventually start the business, unlimited time to eventually repair the relationship, unlimited time to eventually live the life we keep describing as the one we actually want someday, once a few more conditions are met. This contradiction sits at the center of nearly everything Seneca wrote about time, most concentrated in a single essay written to a friend named Paulinus that we now call On the Shortness of Life. And the essay's core argument is stranger and more useful than its title suggests, because Seneca isn't actually arguing that life is short. He spends the opening pages directly rejecting that popular complaint. Life is not short, he insists. We make it short. Nature has given human beings more than enough time to accomplish something meaningful. If only we didn't spend so much of it pouring that time away on things that add up to nothing. The problem Seneca is diagnosing isn't a shortage of time. It's a catastrophic failure to notice how much of the time we do have is being spent on autopilot, on obligations we never examined, on distractions we never chose deliberately, on a vague, comfortable assumption that the real living will start later once the present moment's clutter finally clears. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts a complaint almost everyone has made at some point, usually in a tired, resigned tone. There's just never enough time. Seneca's response to that complaint is not comfort. It's closer to a confrontation. He would ask you to actually account for where your time has gone, not in vague terms, but specifically, honestly, itemize the way you might itemize spending on a bank statement you're finally forcing yourself to review after months of avoiding it. And his prediction, based on watching the people around him in Rome, was that most people, if they actually did this accounting honestly, would discover something uncomfortable, that an enormous portion of their supposedly limited time was never actually stolen from them by external circumstances at all. It was given away voluntarily in small increments to things that felt urgent in the moment and turned out on reflection to have mattered very little. Let's take the specific quote about mortality and immortality and unpack why Seneca chose exactly this framing, because the precision matters. Fear of death is, for most people, something that arrives in flashes, usually triggered by a specific reminder, a diagnosis, a close call, news of someone else's death, a milestone birthday. In those flashes, people report a genuine, sometimes overwhelming clarity about what actually matters to them. Career politics that consumed enormous mental energy suddenly seem absurd. Grudges that felt important seem suddenly not worth the energy they were costing. Conversations people have been avoiding for years suddenly seem urgent, worth having immediately, regardless of the discomfort involved. This is the mortal mode Seneca is describing, the state of mind that emerges when death feels close and real rather than abstract and distant. The immortal mode, by contrast, is the state most people spend the overwhelming majority of their actual lives inhabiting, precisely because death, most of the time, does not feel close or real. It feels like a fact you technically know but don't actually believe on any emotional level, the way you technically know a distant country exists without that knowledge affecting how you plan your Tuesday. In this mode, ambitious plans get built with an implicit, unstated assumption of unlimited runway. The business will get started once the current job feels more stable. The relationship will get repaired once this particularly busy season passes. The book will get written once retirement finally arrives and there's more free time available. Notice that none of these plans are irrational on their own terms. Each one, taken individually, sounds like reasonable, responsible sequencing. The problem Seneca is pointing to is not any single instance of this reasoning. It's the cumulative pattern, the fact that an entire life can be quietly organized around a string of individually reasonable postponements, each one waiting for conditions that never quite arrive, until supposedly unlimited time that made each postponement feel safe turns out, as it always eventually does, to have had a limit after all. There's a specific passage in Seneca's essay, paraphrased here rather than quoted at length, where he describes watching busy, successful men, senators, generals, wealthy merchants, men who by every external measure had achieved significant things, and noticing that many of them, upon finally reaching old age, expressed something close to genuine shock and grief that their lives were ending, as though they had somehow been cheated out of time they were owed. Seneca's response to this reaction is unusually sharp for him, almost impatient. He argues that these men were not, in fact, cheated. They spent their allotted time exactly the way they chose to spend it, hour by hour, decade by decade, on political maneuvering, on accumulating wealth they had no real plan to enjoy, on obligations and distractions they never once stopped to question. The tragedy, in Seneca's telling, isn't that their lives were too short. It's that they never noticed, while it was happening, how much of that life was being spent on things that would eventually feel, from a vantage point of its ending, like they hadn't actually been living at all, just occupying time, filling it with motion that resembled purpose without actually being purpose. This distinction between being occupied and actually being engaged in living deserves its own careful unpacking, because it's easy to hear it and nod along without registering how uncomfortable it actually is once applied to your own specific life rather than to a general category of other busy people. Seneca draws a sharp line between what he calls true leisure, time genuinely devoted to reflection, meaningful relationships, and deliberate engagement with what actually matters to a person, and what he calls busy idleness, a state that looks, from the outside, like the opposite of leisure, full of motion, meetings, tasks, obligations, but that is, in his analysis, functionally identical to wasted time, because none of that motion is actually chosen or examined. It's simply happening, carrying the person along, the way a current carries a swimmer who has stopped actively choosing a direction. Modern life, it's worth saying plainly, is arguably more efficient at manufacturing busy idleness than anything Seneca could have observed in first-century Rome. Notifications arrive constantly, each one small enough to seem harmless, each one capable of consuming attention for a few minutes that, added together across a single day, frequently amount to hours. Meetings get scheduled by habit rather than necessity, filling calendars with obligations that everyone privately suspects could have been handled in a fraction of the time, if anyone had felt authorized to say so out loud. Entertainment, endlessly available and specifically engineered by extremely well-resourced companies to be as engaging as possible, offers a constant, low-effort alternative to the harder, more deliberate work of actually deciding what a given evening or weekend should be spent on. None of this is presented here as an argument against rest, distraction, or entertainment in general, and it's worth being clear about that, because a joyless, hyperproductive reading of Seneca misses the point of his actual teaching just as badly as a passive, resigned reading does. Seneca was not an advocate for constant, grinding productivity. He explicitly praised leisure, reflection, and even idleness when chosen deliberately and used well. His target was never rest itself. It was the unexamined, accumulated drift of time spent on autopilot, time that technically fills the hours of day without ever being consciously, deliberately chosen. This is where the practical value of Seneca's teaching becomes genuinely actionable rather than simply an elegant piece of ancient rhetoric, because he doesn't just diagnose the problem. He suggests a specific corrective practice, one that translates remarkably well into modern life with almost no modification required. Seneca recommended, in various letters to his friend Lucilius, a habit of regularly, honestly reviewing how time is actually being spent, not in vague, general terms, but specifically, almost like an accountant reviewing ledgers, asking plainly what a given stretch of days or weeks had actually been spent on, and whether that spending reflected the priorities the person claimed to hold, or simply the priorities that happened to grab attention moment by moment, unexamined. Try this yourself, for even a single day, and notice how uncomfortable the honest version of this exercise actually is. At the end of the day, rather than simply moving on to the next one, spend a few minutes tracing back through the hours, as specifically as you can manage. Not, I worked, then I relaxed, but closer to an actual itemized account. There's much time in meetings that could have been emails. There's much time scrolling a phone without any clear intention of what you were looking for. There's much time on a task that genuinely mattered to you. There's much time avoiding a conversation you know needs to happen. Most people who do this exercise honestly, even just once, report a specific kind of discomfort, not because their day was unusually wasteful compared to some external standard, but because the itemized account makes visible something that stays comfortably invisible when time simply flows past unexamined. How much a supposedly full, busy day actually consisted of choices made in the moment that a more deliberate version of the same person would not have made if asked directly, is this really how you want to spend this hour of your one life? Seneca's essay contains another line worth pulling apart carefully, one that gets at exactly why this kind of review matters more than it might initially seem to. He observes that people are careful, even stingy, in guarding their money and their property, but astonishingly careless in how they let other people take their time, often without even noticing it's being taken. Think about how differently most people respond to a request for money versus a request for time. Asked to loan a significant sum of money to a casual acquaintance, most people would hesitate, would think carefully, would probably decline unless there was strong reason to trust the request. Asked to give up an afternoon, an evening, a weekend, to something that doesn't particularly serve their own priorities, simply because someone else asked and it felt awkward to refuse, most people say yes without nearly the same level of scrutiny, as though time, unlike money, were an infinitely renewable resource that costs nothing to give away. Seneca's point here is not that generosity with time is bad. It's that the asymmetry itself is revealing. We instinctively understand that money is finite, that spending it on one thing means not having it available for something else, and we plan accordingly at least most of the time. Time operates under the exact same finite logic, arguably a stricter one, since money, once spent, can sometimes be earned back, while time, once spent, categorically cannot be recovered under any circumstances whatsoever. And yet, most people manage their time a fraction of the deliberateness they apply to managing their money, largely because time doesn't come with a visible balance the way a bank account does. There's no notification that pops up showing how many hours remain, no monthly statement itemizing where the previous month's hours actually went. This invisibility is precisely what allows time to be spent so much more carelessly than money, not because time actually matters less, but because its finite nature is so much easier to forget in the absence of any visible tracking mechanism. This brings up a genuinely useful, practical application, one that requires almost nothing beyond honesty and a willingness to occasionally do some uncomfortable arithmetic. Try just once, actually calculating something concrete about your remaining time, not in a morbid or anxious spirit, but in the same spirit Seneca himself seemed to intend, as a corrective jolt against a comfortable, vague sense that time is essentially unlimited. If you're in your 30s and reasonably healthy, you might have somewhere in a range of 50 more years ahead of you, which sounds substantial until you translate it into a smaller, more visceral unit. 50 more years means roughly 50 more summers. 50 more times watching the leaves change color, if you live somewhere that has seasons. If you see a parent or a close friend a handful of times a year, 50 more years might mean only a few hundred more visits with that specific person, a number that feels dramatically smaller and more urgent once it's actually counted out, compared to the comfortable, uncounted assumption that there will simply always be more time later to see them. This exercise is not meant to produce anxiety, and it's worth being careful here, because there's a version of memento mori, the broader tradition of reflecting on mortality that Seneca's writing belongs to, that can tip into something closer to morbid dread rather than useful clarity, if it's not handled carefully. The goal of counting summers or counting visits, or doing any version of this concrete arithmetic, is not to produce a constant, low-grade panic about death. It's to produce, briefly and usefully, exactly the kind of mortal clarity Seneca described people experiencing in moments of genuine fear, the sudden, sharp sense of what actually matters, but to access that clarity deliberately through honest reflection, rather than only accidentally through an actual health scare or crisis. If a diagnosis or a close call can instantly clarify what matters, the practical question worth asking is whether that same clarity can be accessed on a random Tuesday without needing the crisis to arrive first, simply by choosing to do the arithmetic honestly rather than avoiding it. Marcus Aurelius, writing later but working within the same broader Stoic tradition Seneca helped shape, offers a complementary angle on the same idea, one focused less on counting remaining time and more on the specific quality of the time being lived right now. He repeatedly reminded himself, in his private notebook, that a person only ever actually loses the present moment, since the past is already gone and the future has not yet arrived, and that this present moment, however brief, is the only piece of time anyone genuinely possesses at any given point. This might sound like a small philosophical technicality, but it carries a specific practical implication that pairs powerfully with Seneca's warning about wasted time. If the present moment is the only time you actually have, then the habit of mentally living in some imagined future, the someday where the real living finally starts, is not simply inefficient. It's a systematic refusal to actually inhabit the only time that was ever genuinely available to you in the first place. Every hour spent mentally rehearsing a future that hasn't arrived, rather than genuinely engage with the hour actually happening, is an hour effectively discarded, not because anything external stole it, but because attention itself, the thing that actually makes an hour feel lived rather than merely passed through, was pointed somewhere else entirely. Let's bring this down to a specific, very ordinary example, because the abstract version of this idea is easy to nod along with and easy to forget the moment the video ends. Picture an evening spent with people you genuinely care about, a dinner, a gathering, an ordinary Tuesday night at home with family, and picture the extremely common modern version of how that evening often actually gets spent. Physically present, technically occupying the same room, but mentally somewhere else entirely, half attending to a phone, half rehearsing tomorrow's tasks, half present in a dozen small ways that add up to something close to absence, despite the body remaining fully in the room the entire time. Seneca's framework would describe this evening as a specific, concrete instance of exactly the wasted time he spent his essay warning about, not because anything dramatic went wrong, but because an hour that could have been genuinely, fully lived, an hour that will never come back under any circumstances, was instead spent in a kind of half-presence that will likely be almost entirely forgotten within a matter of weeks, precisely because it was never actually fully experienced in the first place. The corrective here doesn't require dramatic life changes, and it's worth saying that clearly, because Seneca's essay is not actually a call to abandon your job, your obligations, or your ordinary responsibilities in favor of some radical, unsustainable pursuit of constant meaningful presence. It's a call to notice, honestly and regularly, where your attention is actually going and to make more deliberate, conscious choices about redirecting it toward the handful of things that will still matter to you when you eventually do the kind of honest accounting Seneca describes older men doing, often too late to meaningfully act on what they discover. This might mean something as simple as putting a phone in another room during a specific dinner each week, not as a permanent, absolute rule, but as a small, deliberate reclaiming of a few hours that would otherwise slip passed unexamined. It might mean actually scheduling, with the same seriousness you'd schedule an important work meeting, a specific block of time for the relationship, the project, or the conversation you keep telling yourself you'll get to eventually, once things settle down. Precisely because Seneca's entire argument is that things reliably do not settle down on their own, and that waiting for a naturally arriving moment of spaciousness is, for most people, functionally equivalent to waiting forever. There's a final piece of Seneca's argument worth including here, because it addresses directly the objection that might be forming by this point. Isn't some amount of deferred living simply unavoidable, given that most people have genuine obligations, bills to pay, children to raise, responsibilities that can't simply be abandoned in favor of philosophical presence? Seneca would not have disagreed that obligations are real and often unavoidable. His argument was never that responsibility itself is the enemy of a well-spent life. His argument was more specific, that the danger lies in obligations expanding quietly and by default to fill every available hour, crowding out the smaller, deliberately protected pockets of time that a person could genuinely control, if they were honest enough to notice how much of the supposedly unavailable time was actually being spent on things that, on close, honest inspection, mattered considerably less than the person would admit if asked directly. Not every hour of every day can be devoted to what matters most. But Seneca's challenge, stripped down to its simplest, most usable form, is this: of the hours that are genuinely yours to direct, the ones not strictly claimed by unavoidable obligation, how many of them are you spending the way a person who took their own mortality seriously would actually choose to spend them? And how many are simply slipping past, unexamined, under the comfortable, quiet assumption that there will always be more time later to finally start living the way you keep telling yourself you eventually will? Let's slow down and follow one specific, composite example all the way through, because Seneca's warning tends to stay abstract until you actually watch it play out across an entire life, rather than a single day. Picture someone, call him a mid-career professional in his early 40s, who has spent nearly 2 decades telling himself a very specific, very reasonable-sounding story, that the real version of his life, the one where he finally has time for the things he actually cares about, is coming, just not yet, in his 20s. The story was that he needed to establish himself first, get the promotions, build a financial security, and then he'd have room to slow down and actually live the way he wanted to. In his 30s, the story shifted slightly. Now it was about the kids being young, needing every spare hour, and once they were a bit older, one school schedule settled into something more predictable, there would finally be room again. Each version of the story, taken on its own, sounded completely reasonable to him, and to anyone he might have explained it to. Nobody hearing any single chapter of the story would have called it foolish or careless. That's precisely what makes this pattern so dangerous. In Seneca's analysis, it never announces itself as a mistake. It only ever announces itself as sensible sequencing, one reasonable postponement after another, each one small enough to seem harmless in isolation. Now picture the same man in his early 40s, receiving news that a close friend from college, someone his own age, has died suddenly, unexpectedly, of a heart condition nobody had known about. This is exactly the kind of moment Seneca describes producing sudden, sharp mortal clarity. The instant recognition that time is not, in fact, unlimited, that the sequencing he'd been quietly relying on for 2 decades was never actually guaranteed by anything at all. In the days following this news, he finds himself thinking, with startling clarity, about all the specific things he's been quietly postponing. The book he always meant to write. The father he hasn't had an honest conversation with in years. Each of them politely avoiding a rift neither ever addressed directly. The friendships that used to matter enormously to him and have been allowed to fade almost entirely, not through any single decision to let them go, but through years of small, individually reasonable choices to prioritize something more urgent seeming instead. This is the exact fork in the road Seneca's essay is most interested in, because what happens next reveals everything about whether this kind of mortal clarity actually changes anything or simply passes, like weather, leaving the underlying pattern untouched. For many people, and Seneca observed this pattern repeatedly among his own contemporaries, this kind of clarity fades within days or weeks, gradually crowded back out by the same accumulated obligations and habits that have been running the show for years beforehand. The urgency feels real in the moment, genuinely real, but without a deliberate, structural intervention, without something concrete changing about how time actually gets allocated day to day, the clarity tends to evaporate roughly as quickly as it arrived, and the postponement resumes almost exactly where it left off, perhaps with a slightly heavier undertone of guilt attached to it, but functionally unchanged. The alternative path, the one Seneca's entire essay is ultimately trying to persuade his reader toward, involves converting that temporary, crisis-triggered clarity into something more durable, a genuine, structural change in how time gets spent, made while the clarity is still fresh enough to act on, rather than waiting for it to fade and hoping some future crisis will eventually provide another jolt. In practice, for our composite example, this might look like something quite modest and unglamorous, actually calling the father, however awkward that first conversation might be, rather than continuing to wait for some more comfortable moment that experience suggests is unlikely to arrive on its own. It might mean blocking out a genuinely protected hour each week for the writing project, treated with the same non-negotiable seriousness as an important client meeting, rather than remaining an abstract, someday ambition that competes and loses against every more immediately pressing demand on his attention. None of this requires abandoning his career or his responsibilities to his children. It requires a much smaller, much more achievable act of actually converting a handful of hours from unexamined drift into deliberate, protected use, based on an honest reckoning of what he would actually regret, on his own honest assessment, having continued to postpone indefinitely. It's worth pulling apart one more specific line from Seneca's essay, because it adds an important dimension to everything discussed so far. He observes that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it, and that life is long enough, and quite generously given for the accomplishment of great things, if the whole of it is well invested. Notice the specific word choice here, invested, a term borrowed directly from the language of money and finance, deliberately chosen to draw the exact parallel discussed earlier between how carefully most people manage their money and how carelessly most people manage their time. An investment implies deliberate allocation toward a chosen outcome, as opposed to simple spending, which can happen thoughtlessly on impulse, without any clear return in mind. Seneca's claim is that a life spent on genuine investment, hours deliberately allocated toward things a person has actually examined and chosen, tends to feel, in retrospect, considerably longer and more substantial than a life of equal length spent primarily on unexamined, reactive activity, even though both lives, measured purely in years and days, might contain the exact same total number of hours. This is a genuinely testable claim against ordinary experience, and most people, on reflection, find it holds up surprisingly well. Think about how differently a week of genuine engagement, real conversations, meaningful work, deliberate presence with people you love, feels in memory compared to a week spent mostly on autopilot, scrolling, half attending to obligations, moving through motions without much genuine investment of attention. The second week often disappears almost entirely from memory within a matter of months, leaving behind barely a trace, despite having consumed exactly the same 7 days as the first. This isn't a coincidence. In Seneca's framework, it's direct evidence for his underlying claim that a life's actual felt length and substance is determined far more by the quality and deliberateness of attention brought to each portion of it than by the sheer quantity of time technically elapsed. A person who has genuinely invested their attention across a lifetime, even one cut relatively short by outside standards, may in a very real sense have lived a longer, fuller life than someone who reached old age but spent the majority of those additional decades on unexamined, reactive drift. If there's a single practical takeaway to carry out of Seneca's entire argument, distilled down to something genuinely usable on an ordinary week rather than only during a crisis, it's this: pick one thing right now that you've been quietly telling yourself belongs to someday, and ask honestly whether the conditions you're waiting for are actually likely to arrive on their own, or whether, like the busy senators and generals Seneca watched grow old, still waiting for their own supposed someday. You might simply be building an entire structure of postponement on top of a moment that was never actually going to arrive without deliberate action forcing it into being. This doesn't require overhauling an entire life all at once. It requires converting one specific piece of postponed intention into one specific, scheduled, protected action this week, while the clarity of actually confronting this question is still fresh, rather than filing away as another reasonable-sounding plan for later. This is a single, simple, almost unbearably obvious fact that Seneca's entire essay is built around, and it's precisely because it's so obvious that most people manage to avoid actually confronting it on any given ordinary day. Everyone knows, in the abstract, that life ends. Almost nobody organizes their actual daily choices around that knowledge with any real consistency, precisely because the ending feels distant, theoretical, safely far away, right up until, for each person eventually, it isn't. There's one more practical technique worth including here, one that Seneca and other Stoic writers return to repeatedly, sometimes under the label of rehearsing loss in advance, a practice that sounds, on first hearing, considerably darker than it actually turns out to be in application. The idea is straightforward. Periodically, deliberately, and briefly, imagine specific good things in your life as though they'd already ended, not to induce anxiety or dread, but to restore a kind of appreciation that familiarity quietly erodes over time. Consider a specific relationship you might otherwise take for granted precisely because it has always simply been there, a parent, a close friend, a partner. Imagining, briefly and deliberately, a conversation with that person, as though it might be one of the last you get to have, is not intended to produce morbid preoccupation with their eventual death. It's intended to interrupt the specific, quiet mechanism by which familiarity erodes attention. The way a person can walk past a beautiful view every single day until it stops registering as beautiful at all, simply because repetition has trained their attention to stop noticing it. Seneca used a version of this technique himself, and it shows up across his letters in slightly different forms depending on the specific loss or hardship he was preparing a friend to face. He would suggest imagining, in advance and in specific detail, the loss of wealth, of status, of health, of relationships, not because he expected every reader to actually lose all of these things, but because the exercise of imagining loss tends to strip away the layer of entitlement that quietly accumulates around anything a person has held on to for a long time without interruption. Once you briefly imagine genuinely not having something, its actual presence in your life becomes noticeably more vivid, more appreciated, less background noise. Applied specifically to time, this same technique becomes a way of restoring the mortal clarity Seneca described experiencing during moments of genuine fear, but accessing it deliberately on an ordinary day rather than only accidentally when a crisis eventually forces it. Try this once with something specific rather than something abstract. Pick a single ordinary activity you do regularly with someone you care about, a weekly phone call, a shared meal, a routine you've come to treat as simply part of the background architecture of your life. Spend 2 or 3 minutes, honestly and specifically, imagining that this particular instance of the activity is the final one you'll ever get to have, not because you have any actual reason to believe that's true, but purely as a deliberate exercise in restoring the attention that routine has quietly worn away. Most people who try this report a noticeable, immediate shift in how present they feel during the actual next occurrence of that activity, a sharper appreciation for details that have become nearly invisible through sheer repetition. This is not a technique to be used constantly, Since a person cannot sustainably treat every single moment as potentially the last without exhausting themselves emotionally in a way Seneca never actually recommended, but used occasionally, deliberately, as a periodic corrective against the specific way familiarity dulls attention. It offers a genuinely accessible way of borrowing the clarity that crisis provides, without needing to wait for an actual crisis to arrive first. None of this changes the basic arithmetic of a finite life, and Seneca never claimed it would. What it changes is something more modest, but considerably more within your actual control. How much of the time you do it gets spent genuinely present and attentive, chosen deliberately, versus how much simply passes by unexamined, absorbed by obligations and distractions that were never actually weighed against what you genuinely regret losing. Marcus Aurelius, writing a century or so after Seneca, but clearly working within the same intellectual inheritance, offers a closing frame worth carrying with you. He reminded himself, in one of his private entries, that a person could leave this life at any moment, and that this simple fact should shape how they act, speak, and think right now, rather than being filed away as a distant, someday concern. He wasn't writing this as a threat or a source of dread. He was writing it as a tool, a deliberate corrective against exactly the kind of quiet, comfortable drift Seneca spent his entire essay warning about, the drift where a life gets organized around an unstated, unexamined assumption of unlimited time, right up until that assumption turns out, as it eventually does for absolutely everyone, to have been false all along. Neither man was arguing for constant anxiety about death. Both were arguing for something considerably more useful and considerably more available on an ordinary Tuesday, a periodic, deliberate willingness to remember that the current moment, whatever it contains, is not guaranteed to be followed by an infinite supply of similar moments, and that this remembering, uncomfortable as it can be, tends to produce exactly the kind of clarity about what actually matters that so many people otherwise only stumble into by accident, usually far later than they would have liked, and usually only after a considerable portion of their allotted, genuinely finite time has already quietly slipped away. The time will not, in fact, always be there later.